Buy a subscription to The Athletic this December and gift one absolutely free. See the link in the description for more information. Alex Ferguson has been busy since his retirement in 2013. He's spoken and taught at Harvard Business School, had a hip replacement, been on a cruise around the Hebrides, and attended the Oscars, butterflying among stars like Reese Witherspoon, Samuel L. Jackson, and Serena Williams. He's also found time to update his autobiography and release a new, highly successful book which describes key skills in leadership and lessons learned from decades of footballing success. So there was no flat cap and allotment for Ferguson, but his relationship with Manchester United lacks the same kind of definition, and his influence on the club's present is relatively tenuous. Officially, Ferguson is a non-executive director and a global ambassador. In January 2015, annual accounts released by the club revealed that he was being paid about £2.1 million for his role. In 2018, the Daily Mail's Charlie Sale reported that figure had risen to £2.3 million. So he's extremely well remunerated, but not necessarily hugely relevant to the club's day-to-day operations, and that's partly to do with the organisation's evolution in the years since. Back in 2013, Ferguson's retirement caused a great stress on Manchester United, with the efforts remaining in evidence to this day. It was not the only change the club endured that summer though, with the departure of long-term CEO David Gill, who also retreated to a non-executive role. Gill had worked at United in different capacities since 1997 and was a natural Ferguson ally. When he was replaced by Ed Woodward, whose association with the club began with an advisory role during the Glazer family takeover, it marked the beginning of a new era and the replacement of the old nucleus of power. Of course, for some, Ferguson's retirement is entwined with the doomed appointment of David Moyes. In the years since, he has rallied against the accusation that he was the sole driving force behind Moyes' arrival, and in his words, the accepted view out there that there was no process. Nonsense, he says. Nevertheless, Moyes publicly enjoyed Ferguson's patronage before joining the club, and it was Ferguson himself who telephoned the then Everton manager to tell him that the job was his. However important his voice had been in making the decision, it would never be so again. Ferguson was mindful of his shadow when Moyes arrived, a familiar trope in English football, seen at United with Matt Busby and Liverpool with Bill Shankly, has been the damaging proximity of a retired legend. Ferguson was keen to avoid adding to those examples, intentionally keeping his distance during Moyes' succession. Of course, in private, he was supportive. In his autobiography, he recalls speaking to Moyes several times during the darker moments, but he was intentionally reserved and, in any case, admitted that whatever football appetites he still had were being served by his appointment to an ambassadorial role with UEFA and his chairing of their coaching seminars. His relationships with the three coaches who followed Moyes have each been different. Ferguson has spoken of his admiration for Louis van Gaal, both in respect of his gravitas and, coincidentally, given the stylistic inertia that he would bring to Old Trafford, the brand of football. But there was no closeness between the two, whether unintentionally so or by design. Jose Mourinho offered a different dynamic. Publicly, he had always treated Ferguson with reverence, and he was also the first of Ferguson's successors to invite him back to Carrington. And, with enough time having passed since his retirement, it was a gesture Ferguson appreciated. As was to be expected, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was also very welcoming. Ferguson suffered a brain hemorrhage in May of 2018 and would require life-saving surgery, but he would make a full recovery and was welcomed back to the training ground in January 2019, shortly before, under Solskjaer's temporary control, United beat Tottenham at Wembley. After that victory, which was part of a sequence which helped securing Solskjaer the job on a permanent basis, Ferguson and his grandson were invited onto the team coach. Now, these moments have been ceremonial in tone, of course. Ferguson's influence is subliminal but very real on his former player. It appears in literal gestures, like Solskjaer's insistence that players should travel to away games in club suits, an old rule from the Ferguson era. And in more subtle ways too, such as in the way he refers to young players as boys and how recently he made an impassioned complaint about fixture congestion live on British television. Small details, but Fergusonism's all the same. And, while Solskjaer is very much now his own manager, the two still periodically meet after games. Nevertheless, Ferguson's footballing expertise are rarely employed by the club. He keeps an office at Old Trafford, which he uses for entertaining and for hospitality. He attends nearly every home game, eating meals in the main stand before taking his seat in the director's box. And prior to his surgery, he would sometimes accompany the first team to away games in Europe, on tours overseas, or, if the situation warranted, be part of the club's commercial interaction with major sponsors. Naturally though, with Ferguson now approaching his 79th birthday and having suffered such a serious illness, he tends to take part in the more informal aspects of club business. Meeting opposition dignitaries before matches, for instance, or helping to convince new signings to join. Ferguson was part of the red carpet rolled out for Jude Bellingham in early 2020. Although the young midfielder would ultimately decide to join Borussia Dortmund, he and his family met with Ferguson during their tour of the club's training facilities and were said to be impressed by whatever they heard. But while there may be occasional exceptions, these are the limits of Ferguson's authority. He remains revered and respected, as well he might, but he is not, and nor ever has been, any sort of puppet master or backseat driver. If you're looking for holiday gifts this winter, we're pleased to be able to offer a buy one, gift one deal on subscriptions to The Athletic. It's world-class sports journalism with a roster of writers including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence, Daniel Taylor and Ollie Kay. There's dedicated journalists for each Premier League team, bringing you all the latest news and inside information, not to mention hundreds of journalists doing the very same thing for 10 other sports. So, to buy one and gift one this December, see the link in the description, and thanks for watching today's video.